Self-dubbed the most pro-union president, Joe Biden has not visited the Detroit United Auto Workers strike, nor does he appear to have plans to. Here is what White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre told reporters in the press briefing yesterday. Let's watch.
The president's schedule. What I can say is the president is very, I guess, seeing them continue to be at the negotiating table. All parties continuing to be at the negotiating table is a positive. That is important. They've been certainly doing that for the past 24/7. It is important to have that collective bargaining. The president has been very clear about that, and so we are going to assist the White House along with the Department of Labor with the leadership of Acting Secretary Sue, to make sure that we provide assistance or any guidance as it is requested to all parties.
Talks remain up in the air, but new polling from a progressive nonprofit, More Perfect Union, shows that over half of likely voters, 58%, support the strike and 17% do not. Half of voters who identify as Trump supporters back the movement, while 70% of Biden voters agree.
Do you think that he should go with the UAW strikers?
So I talked about this on another network a few days ago, and I absolutely do. I think that the Biden administration is taking the wrong tone here. For a president who has, and this even decades before he became president, has always been someone who's been the standard bearer for unions. He has recruited union workers. He spoke at the union lodges. He's built up support. He's been extremely progressive in his view and support of unions, even though America hasn't always been. At this point in our nation's history, Americans have a more strong fervor and more strong support of unions than they did in 1965. We haven't seen those numbers the same in decades. And I think part of that is because of the economic strife we're seeing, also because people want higher wages, because we saw the inflationary costs, because they're seeing, their mortgage increases, rent increases and things like that. And they're fighting for those workers' protections. And unions have been the backbone of that for the industrialized America for quite some time. I'm from the Midwest. If you're from Chicago, that's a big union town. If you're talking about Ohio, you're talking about areas in Michigan, you're talking about Detroit. These are big union centers. So I think that for Biden, there's a conflict here. One, he's always been pro-union, but he's also pro-EV. And when we talk about electronic vehicles, there is a realism that comes with the fact that typically to do good by the environment, to do well by the environment also means that there are changes in the way that we do business. And that business model, sadly, will have an effect on those workers. And I think that that is the juxtaposition that he's working with.
Yeah, I think you've nailed it, Ameshia. I mean, truly, the electric vehicle mandates are going to be really, really a huge challenge for these automakers. The vehicles only require about 30% of the labor that a traditional gas-powered vehicle requires. The most expensive part of the vehicle, the batteries, are mostly manufactured in China right now. The U.S. doesn't really have the capacity to either mine the materials or to put together the batteries. At least the workers aren't trained to do it. And when you're looking at an industry that's already really struggling with offshore manufacturing and the fact that a lot of the foreign car companies are able to produce much cheaper vehicles that honestly kind of are better quality at this point, asking for a 40% raise in addition to the electric vehicle mandate is going to cripple these companies. And so when you look at Biden's approach to this, I think he has to be able to say, it does no good for the companies to give the strikers what they want if the industry is going to be decimated in a few years anyway by the policies that I'm proposing. And so, I'd rather see the workers get paid better. I'd rather see them have better working conditions and at least get a 20% pay increase, which would make up for the decline in real wages since 2008 due to inflation, as opposed to trying to shoehorn in the EV movement.
Now, to be honest, even without the EV movement, there was going to be auto manufacturers who decided to have their cars made in a cheaper place.
Yeah.
And I think that that is factual, and that's something we see across multiple industries. I said pretty much the same thing that you just did when we saw the Fight for 15 basically take over across the country. As much as we want to see people paid their worth and we want to be able to see people not have to work 2 and 3 jobs to be able to take care of their families, there's also a realism that comes with advances in technology, advances in doing things faster, making sure that, we are able to produce more in an efficient manner. And typically that sadly does put out of business people who have basically devoted their lives to a particular industry. We've seen that time and again throughout the course of history. When the factories left in the 60s and 70s and expedited in the early 80s. That decimated a majority of the Midwest. And those opportunities moved to China. That is what it is. Here we're going to see an instance where a lot of these auto manufacturers are going to up and go, or they're going to do what we've seen many do already, where they've gone to non-union places. I remember when the Nissan plant opened in Jackson, Mississippi, they went there because largely they were not going to be held to the fire about paying fair share, paying people the wages that they deserved. And that's how America has been that tussle for quite some time now. This president is sadly, caught up in the middle of it. I think that former President Trump is going to take advantage of that, and he's definitely going to pop up. He's going to talk to auto workers, and he's going to bring up the electric vehicles. That's going to be a big sticking point in his conversation when he goes to Detroit.
Exactly, and the UAW leader, Shawn Fain, has said that Trump has a point there, that when he talks to the workers in his union, that they do feel quite disillusioned by the green energy movement and how it affects their industry. And Trump is actually planning to go to Detroit and deliver a speech during the next Republican debate. That's, of course, going to be heavily televised. It's kind of a brilliant move. And you're exactly right. Biden has given him that opportunity by not being, I think, strong enough in support of these workers. And to your point about manufacturing and offshoring, in addition to the economic consequences of that and the consequences to the job workforce, we also have to think about national security concerns, right? I mean, during the pandemic, we saw the consequences of offshoring so many of our medical supplies and our medicine to countries like China, where they just held the reins and said, we're only going to give you as much as we want to give you, even when we're in the middle of this pandemic and this emergency where people are dropping dead and need access to medical care and medical equipment. And one of the things that Trump did or planned to do and never actually did, that I was sharply critical of him for, was he had introduced this idea of Made in America, which would have required government contracts for some of those materials to only purchase from American companies or companies that make those products in America. It was on his desk. He never signed it. And then Biden, sort of brilliantly, in a flip side of what's happening here with the UAW strike, is Biden took up the Made in America mantle, and he actually did pass some, obviously signed, not passed, but pushed through some legislation that he signed that would have reshored some critical industries. And so I'd like to see something similar for other areas of manufacturing so that American workers get what they're due. And obviously there is going to be an element always of people having to be retrained later in life potentially to keep up with technology. But I do think there's more that we can do to protect the industry and keep workers in these roles for as long as possible.
No, I think I definitely agree there. There was a big hurrah, which was deserved, around the CHIPS Act, specifically Biden basically designing a plan to ensure that there would be these processes that allow things that we heavily depended on China for to be made right here in America, specifically the chips that we use for everything, our phones, you name it. And I think that there is something to be said about in America that once was the leader in terms of innovation, in terms of creating things right here. And we kind of ceded that. And at this point, it becomes a whole lot harder to hold on to what we let go of. And that didn't start with Biden.
Absolutely. Meanwhile, South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, who is running for president in the GOP primary, is against those picketing altogether. While speaking with voters in Iowa, he staked his position. Let's watch.
I think Ronald Reagan gave us a great example when federal employees decided they were going to strike. He said, you strike, you're fired. Simple concept to me.
Scott's comment might get him into some hot water. President of UAW Shawn Fain filed a complaint against Scott with the National Labor Relations Board on Thursday, stating that he broke federal law. This is according to The Intercept. Workers are protected under the National Labor Relations Act to file a complaint against employers. What a boneheaded move. I mean, so this guy was so low energy in the first debate. He needs a big campaign moment to really push his stock up in the GOP primary. And in a Republican Party that is increasingly embracing labor, to come out and say that, what are you thinking?
So you took the words out of my mouth here. There's very little to add. I feel as though Tim Scott was trying to get his name in news. He was trying, he basically flailed on that stage, which was unexpected for me watching. I was like, I forgot he was there for a while.
Yeah.
The other part of that is he wasn't speaking to a national audience. This is a Tim Scott who essentially was speaking to South Carolina, a state that is anti-union, a state that does not have unions, a state that is a right to labor state, and one that runs against, in many cases, the national polling we've seen on unions and union leadership. And I think that at this point, he's got to get out of this myopic view because he's running for president of the United States. There is no such thing as president of South Carolina, and he's not running for governor of South Carolina. So there has to be a conversation point that he has, recognizing the states he has to go through to even make this make sense in a primary. And I don't think that he's there. These strikes matter. Nobody else on the Republican side took the tone that he did. That's cue number one, that you're probably off kilter. And I don't see how this helps him. And right now, you know, he's getting backlash that it was greatly deserved because he said something completely ignorant, but it was backlash that he brought on himself.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think there's a way that as a Republican or as a conservative, you can be skeptical of union leadership and maybe talk about some of the corruption that occurs in unions. But to come out as just anti-union in general is something that the country is not on board with, and for good reason, right? I mean, people, especially now, you said it earlier in the segment, with the current economic conditions, the ability to lobby your employer is more important than ever. I mean, this is a very tight labor market, and the conditions are good for workers to be able to make those negotiation processes happen. And so, again, it's just boneheaded. I don't understand it from Tim Scott. I don't know who's advising him. I don't know if this was a campaign person that told him that he should try to set himself apart from the field by doing this. But overall, the whole tenor of his campaign has just been one step behind or 5 steps in the completely wrong direction. And he's going to have to course correct majorly by the next debate, or I think it's over for him.
No, absolutely. I think that being anti-worker is definitely not the thing you ever want to do. But, you know, and I don't say this often, but to Trump's credit, when he was actually running 4 years ago, when he was running 8 years ago, and running now, he was able to meld in a way conversation around building up the average American worker,
right,
in a way that I think is often forgotten about in its level of importance to the growth of our economy, but also to people. They don't want to be talked at. They want to be spoken. They want you to speak about the things that are affecting their daily lives, and being able to pay your bills is definitely one of them. And Tim Scott just seemed to miss every single cue possible in one fatal swoop. So I don't know how he comes back from this. Then again, his campaign was already in the hole, so he can't go any further than he already is now. He's at the bottom.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the concern now for his campaign is, what does this mean about the race for vice president? Because his name has been floated a lot for potentially being Trump's running mate. And if he continues to make gaffes like this, and also just set himself apart from Trumpism as we now know it in the Republican Party, he's going to go a different direction because that's a liability, that comment right there. We're going to be back with more Rising after this.